Hello fellow Spellstone Magicians, this is the Endymion Diamond Guide. I will now be going over every card in this deck list since a lot of these were mentioned in the original guide. If you have not seen the original guide, I will link it in the description below. So starting from left to right, we're going to talk about souls. The reason I use souls is because of this first effect, where you can send up to 2 spell traps from your hand or field to the graveyard to then draw that many cards. So as you can probably see from my deck list, I do run Regeki, Duster, and Darkroot no more. So this does help me kind of unbrick if I end up getting that. It also helps me unbrick if I draw into the Spellbook of Knowledge, or if I draw into the second copy of Secrets. Its other effect, being able to summon it itself by milling a level 6 or higher spellcaster, is also really good. You can send either a Jackal King, an Endymion, or even another Cerberus. The reason I don't run Reflection here is because I realized, kind of just been playing Endymion for so long, that I don't really ever use Reflection much. So with that being said, I did drop Reflection. Now off to the next, which is the Spellbook engine. So many of you know that I am a Desires enjoyer. I love Desires. I prefer it over the Spellbook engine. The reason I don't run it in this one is because I have only one Kendo, I have only one Garuda, and then I'm still also having the one Regeki, Duster, and Darkroot no more, which I may want to have in my hand, right, for a follow-up turn. And so I would rather not have those banished. And so that's the reason I run the Spellbook engine instead of Desires. And on top of that, since I do run the Magician Souls, it means that the brickness of opening with knowledge first is a lot more rare. Do keep note that the Spellbook engine, since the Magician does require a normal summon, do know that it will kind of conflict with Baby Jackal when you would summon Baby Jackal and then activate 3 spell cards to then get Jackal King early in your combo, right? That may be a conflict. However, if you do happen to open, let's say, Magician Souls, Baby Jackal, and then a Secret, you could try to instead still do that same starter combo where you summon normal Jackal, go into Jackal King, and then when you use Secrets, just use the knowledge on Souls instead of what would normally be the Prophecy Magician. Next, we're going to talk about Kendo. Now, Kendo, I have talked about this in the original guide, but I'm going to add a little bit more to what I said last time. With cards like Beyond the Pendulum, which we will discuss a little later in this guide, he's just really good now. I feel like he's even better because now he's pretty much always going to be searchable for you. And the reason you use him, despite there being no other level 8s, because there is Cerberus, but if you're going turn 1, then obviously you will probably not summon Cerberus on your first turn. The reason I like him is because when you Pendulum summon, he comes back to your hand. So that means that he's safe from, like, your opponent's Duster, for example. So that's the reason that he is still here, despite me not having any more level 8s, because in my original guide, I ran Dissolver. That's why Kendo had, like, had decent targets, because he had Dissolver that he can summon too. In this case, he don't really have that, he just got Cerberus. But he's still pretty good, just being able to come back to your hand. Now, skipping all the way to the board breakers, being Regeki, Duster, and Darkroot no more. I did Regeki because board wipe negation, or board wide negation, isn't as necessary as in earlier seasons. With VFD gone, with the Halkaban gone, therefore, there's no Colossus, Borlo, Barone, shenanigans. Regeki does seem a little bit better. It seemed to have aged well since then. I was going to put a second Regeki in here, but I didn't want to get rid of Darkruler no more for it, because there are cards out there that do have protection, such as Sword Soul Chen Ying. There's also cards like the Borlin Dragon from the Dragon Link deck, right? That's immune to destruction. So that is why I have both one Regeki and one Darkruler, because while Regeki does handle a lot of the problems, or a lot of the boss monsters, there are a couple where you will prefer to have Darkruler no more. So I just run one of each. And then Duster is here because I got tired of dealing with Blackout, Branded in Red, and all that good stuff. And of course it hits impermanent stuff, but normally you're scared more so for cards like Blackout and Branded in Red. So that's the reason this is here. It's also good against Etlich, obviously, but the main reason I did run this was because of Blackout and Branded in Red. And most decks do have back row. I noticed like a lot more decks are running some form of back row, whether it be the Solemns or be the Imperms, or like in this case like Branded in Red, Blackout. So I do think that back row removal is a little bit like more useful. It's more consistent because in earlier seasons, right? If you ran too much back row removal, it would be very inconsistent because back then only like 2 decks ran back row, right? Outside of Imperm. But now I think Duster or like MST is a lot more useful now than it was in earlier seasons. For us, we're lucky because we have Garuda still, and Garuda can pop. So we basically have like an MST and then a Duster, pretty much. So we have 2 cards of back row removal, while also having 2 forms of dealing with monsters. Now next, we are going to be talking about the triple tactics. This card. So I crafted this because people would tell me that it was good, and I do think it is good. But I've seen people run 2 of this. I would probably only run 1, to be honest. I don't recommend 2. People I know who have ran 2 dropped 1 because they said that they drew it too many times. So I feel like going 1 is probably the best, because this is typically seen as a anti-hand trap card. So with Called By, this deck has 3 anti-hand trap cards. However, it can also work against going second. So if you are fighting against the Barone, right? And then you activate like Cerberus, and then they negate it. What you could then do is use Triple Tactics Talent. You can either take control of that Barone, you can draw 2 cards, or you can basically look at your opponent's hand and choose 1 card from it and shove it into the deck. So all of these are pretty good utility. You're most likely going to draw 2 cards. I've never really chose that last effect, but that last one could be good if you want to rip another hand trap. So like, let's say that, they ash you, right? And then this is active, this is live. So you could look at your opponent's hand and then like shuffle their nib. And something to be aware of is that it says if your opponent has activated a monster effect. And that's important because Called By doesn't negate the activation, it negates the effect. So if they were to ash you, right? If you activate Called By the Grave, you banish it, it's negated. Tactics is still live. Because Ash did activate, it's just that its effect was negated. So that's something to keep aware of. That is why these 2 together, pretty good, pretty toxic. Now next we're going to be talking about Necro Valley. So, this is kind of obvious, right? Necro Valley stops a lot of decks. It stops Source Soul pretty much dead in their tracks because they can't banish anything. And that kind of like hurts like majority of their monsters. And they can't move them either, so they can't like special summon stuff from the graveyard. It stops the Tingy portion of their deck, because that also love to banish cards. This also is good against Branded, actually, funny enough, because obviously they like move stuff from the graveyard to fuse and all that shenanigans. But it also stops cards like Branded in Red, right? Because Branded in Red has to move a card from the graveyard to activate its effect, right? Necro Valley negates that. So it also counters against Branded in Red. Next being Secret Village. So I at first did not run this, but I got tired of being super polyed, and so I just use Secret Village now. Because I think I did like 5 duels, in like 4 of them, my opponent top deck super poly. That's alright fam. It's like, alright, this is enough. So I then added Secret Village, and that's why it is there. Now, it does also help you against things like a Droplet, Lightning Storm, Regeki, Duster, all those cards. It does stop those. But the main reason I ran it was because of super Poly. Now let's go to Instant Fusion, right? Because I did skip it for a reason. Because now we're going to the extra deck. So let's talk about the Instant Fusion Brigade. So I used to run this card. Oops, I spelled that wrong. I used to run this one. Now, in case you don't know, the Wind Barrier statue is getting banned next month. So this card is no longer necessary, but you could run it still. You could run it, but it's just not really needed anymore, which is good because then that opens us up for our deck space. My choice was Millennium Ice Restrict and Winda, and obviously the new card Chef. So first, let's talk about Restrict and Winda. It's pretty obvious stuff. So Restrict works well because it stops hand traps. So like if your opponent was to ash you, you could target that ash and then like negate it, right? Because then he'll target the ash, he'll grab it, equip ash to him, and then ash will be negated. But this does have some other utility. So let's say that someone activates, let's say Lubellion, right? Because Lubellion discards a card, then fuses, right? If they were to go into Lubellion using Brain Fusion, when they activate his effect, what you could do is target the Albas in their graveyard and then equip it to Millennium Eyes. Then what happens is that they can't summon Mirror Jade because you took their Albas. Right? That's one pretty good one. You can also just equip the Lubellion. Yeah, can't talk. You can also equip the Lubellion himself to Millennium Eyes Restrict. That's also another thing you can do. Or like if they were to use something like Brendan in Red, right? Well, actually, no, that won't work because just so you know, so even though it says when your opponent activates a monster effect, right? You don't need to target the monster that has activated its effect. You can just target like any monster on the field or graveyard. So like, let's say that, let's take Borlin. So Borlin, as part of his effect, targets a card in the graveyard. So what you could do is that when Borlin activates its effect, you could then steal the card in the graveyard with Restrict, equip it, and therefore Borlin's effect should fizzle. So that's another good option that you can do. Now his effect does not work well with Necro Valley, or let me rephrase that. It doesn't work as well with Necro Valley, because then if your opponent sends a card to the graveyard, you cannot equip that card to it. So therefore, you are forced to only be able to equip targets on the field to it, which normally doesn't really come into play that much. Meaning that distinction isn't too bad, but it is something to be aware of. Next, we're going to talk about Winda real quick. Winda is basically Jowgen, but softer. But by her being a spellcaster, she is able to be special summoned, and on top of that, she cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. So it does make it harder for them to out her than someone like Jowgen, right? But you could argue that she's easier because your opponent can still summon at least once. So that is something to be wary of. But like I said, if they go into battle phase to attack over her, you can easily just summon Selene again. So that's something to think about. Now the Chef. This is a new card that came in, I think, a month or two ago. And you would only use this so that to get into Might. So what it is that let's say that you bricked real bad, but you have at least one normal summonable pendulum monster. You can use this. Or if you have Cerberus, right? You activate Cerberus to get Jekyll King. You use King to then summon Cerberus. You could then use Instant Fusion to then bring this out, and then go into Might. And that's pretty much what you use it for. You probably never gonna ever use either of its effects, so don't even worry about those. And ruling wise, Vortex. So Vortex shuffles a pendulum monster from the extra deck into the deck. Just so you know, you cannot shuffle this into the deck. It will not allow you to. And the reason, now I thought that if you were to shuffle this while it's face up in the extra deck, I just thought that it would just go face down in the extra deck, right? But it doesn't. So with that being said, you cannot shuffle this with Vortex's effect. So if this is the only monster in your face up extra deck, just know that Vortex cannot use this effect. Just FYI. Now to the waifu of the week, Beyond the Pendulum. So this is really good. I would recommend that every deck or every pendulum deck runs at least one of this. I probably would not run 2 or 3, just 1. I don't know why you would ever. I mean, I've seen some run 2 of her. I don't really know why. So if this card is link summoned in the extra monster zone, that's important. You can pay 1200 life points, add 1 pendulum monster from your deck to your hand. But for the rest of this turn, unless you pendulum summon after this effect resolves, you cannot activate monster effects, and the effects of any card in your pendulum zones are negated. So, that's a lot. But basically what it is you pay a stack, so 1200, to then add any 1 pendulum monster. This is typically used to complete your scales, so like, if you have, let's say, all high scales, Beyond will basically guarantee that you get a low scale. And then vice versa. So you get all low scales, go into this, and then you get you a high scale. Now, for the second part of this effect, where it says you cannot activate monster effects, that is something to be wary of, because if your opponent has like nib, this basically opens you up to be nibbed. Now, the cool part is that if they were to imperm this, if I'm correct, if they were to imperm this, what happened? Yeah, if they were to imperm this, you do not have to deal with its restriction. So that's good to know. And where it says the effects of any cards in your pendulum zones are negated, just know that that's only in your pendulum zones. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but people misremember and they think that it does negate monster effects. It does not negate monster effects. It just says they can be activated. So if you have, let's say, Jackal King on the field, Jackal King will keep and continue gaining spell counters. He just can't activate his monster effects until you pendulum summon. Now, its last effect, and this does mean that cards in your pendulum zones, so like Servant and Magister, will lose their spell counters. Now, as far as last effect, which says that if two monsters with different original levels are pendulum summoned at the same time to the zones this card points to, you can target 2 cards on the field, destroy them. So it sucks that this says target 2 cards, not target up to 2 cards. However, I mean, it's pretty good. You probably won't really use it that much. You could use it to like destroy like a chicken game. And if you're going second, I mean, obviously that's good. If you're going second, then she can pop 2 of your opponent's monsters, right? So that is something that's also pretty good. And that's pretty much about it. The hype is normally that she can just finish your scales, right? And then if you did complete your scales, right? So let's say that you have a Servant and a Kendo. Well, Beyond just allow you to get just another body. Now, you don't have to always go into this. Sometimes going into Selene and then just pendulum summoning from that is good enough. It depends on your build whether you go into her or not, or it depends on what's in your hand, right? So basically, game state wise or board state wise, it depends on that, on whether you go into her or whether just go into Selene and then play like normally. Now, IP is a card that I've also added. IP is pretty basic. Basically, if a link monster that used her as material cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects, and then she has the quick effect where during your opponent's main phase, you can link summon 1 link monster using materials you control, including this card. You typically use that with cards like Acromax. because he cannot be targeted with card effects, and your opponent cannot target other monsters for attack except him. So with IP, you now have a monster that cannot be targeted or destroyed by card effects, and they must attack it, which I will go into a little bit later. Because with Afra, there is the quick effect where it says once per battle during damage calculation, if this card battles a special summoned monster, quick effect, you can make this card gain attack equal to that monster's attack during that calculation only. So that's pretty good because it makes it so that it's really hard to destroy by battle, for one. And then with IP, it makes it so that it cannot be destroyed by card effects, and then it already can't be triggered by card effects, and then your opponent must attack it. So like they can't attack like your Jackal King instead. They must attack this one. And then if they seem to remove it, whether it be like by Kaiju or something, you can shuffle one card on the field into their deck. Now, you don't really summon this like on your turn 1. You typically summon this during your opponent's turn. Right? So like if your opponent brings out a threat that you might not be able to handle, you can use IP to then summon Aframax, and therefore it will give you a pretty good protection on not only him but your other monsters. And next we have Goddess, the last one. So Goddess of the Underworld, Underworld Goddess of the Close World, is a 3k attack monster, pretty good. And she requires 4+ effect monsters. So what this basically means is that you can use either 4 of your own, right? Or 3 monsters plus 1 link 2. Because as part of her summoning condition, or her summoning mechanical, however you want to say it, you can also use 1 monster your opponent controls as material to link summon this card. So this is typically used with IP, because you can go IP, treat her as 2 materials, pick 2 other monsters, and then pick an opponent's monster, and then link off with that. However, if it's your turn, or not even if it's your turn, even if it's during their turn, if they too have a link 2 monster, you can treat their link 2 as 2 materials. So like let's say that you're facing lots of salads, and let's say that you're turn 2, you could use their link 2 as 2 materials for this card. So keep that in mind. Now, the reason it's so good, besides being a kaiju, essentially, if this card is link summoned, you can negate the effects of all face-up monsters your opponent currently controls. That's just really good. It can negate things like access code, right? So if your opponent tries to access code you, you can make it. If you can make a comeback, right? If they don't kill you, you can on your next turn do your shenanigans, summon Underworld, and then negate its effect. Though at that point you would probably just use Afra, right? Because having Afra, Appaloosa, access code, and this card kind of makes it so that you pretty much always have an answer should you be able to, pick the materials. The other one though, the real kicker, is that this link summoned card is unaffected by your opponent's activated effects unless they target this card. So things like Imperm can stop it and stuff, but if your opponent wants to do something like access code, for example, they can't really hit it because he don't target. Now obviously access code can just beat over it, but you get my point. What's another card that I can think of? Sorry, I can't think of anything right now, but basically any card that doesn't target. Oh yeah, what's his face? Mirror Jade. She can't be hit by Mirror Jade. She's unaffected by things like Queritus, I think his name is, and Despia, the one that drops attack to 0. She's immune to that because it doesn't target. She's immune to Regeki, Lightning Storm, all those good stuff. Dark Ruler No More, funny enough. Forbidden Droplet. Now, she does have a negate too on top of that, where once per turn, when your opponent activates a card or effect that special summons a monsters from the graveyard, you can negate that activation. That's a once per turn. It is a soft once per turn, but I highly doubt you will be summoning multiples of this. But it it is a soft once per turn. So if you do happen to recycle this, right? So like let's say you activate it and then you recycle it somehow, that is an option. So and that will be the end of the Diamond Guide. Not really much else to say. The combos are pretty much the same. There's like minor variations, but other than that, it's pretty much the exact same deck as far as combos are concerned. It's just that you have more like avenues to go. And with that being said, have a nice day and see you later. Hello guys, before you go, I just realized that I did not mention these cards in the Diamond Guide, which I was supposed to. So I'm going to mention them right now real quick. Magical Abductor. If you're running Beyond the Pendulum, you can probably remove this, since Beyond the Pendulum pretty much does her job. So you could probably remove this. You could use its monster effect to then search souls, but then that means that you're either summoning this through pendulums or you're normal summoning this, which you probably shouldn't really be doing in this deck list. But even in other deck lists, from what I've seen, you should probably remove Magical Abductor and just use Beyond the Pendulum. Because Beyond does her job, but better, especially since Beyond is an extra deck monster, so you don't have to like draw into it, don't like brick with it or anything. So I would recommend you to drop this and use Beyond instead. 1 Day of Peace. Stop using this. I had people come into the Endymion channel in the Master Duel meta Discord. I am a Endymion deck helper. Stop using this, please. It's not good. You're giving your opponent a draw. It's a +0 for you, and it's a +1 for your opponent, which is terrible. And if you really need that effect of neither player takes damage, you're probably losing. Alright, you're probably losing. Don't run this. Run literally anything else. Run Into the Void, Allure of Darkness, anything else but this card. Now for Citadel, it's still useful. You've seen it in my original guide. It hasn't lose any powers. Pretty much the same. So that is an option. So like if you don't have Valley, for example, just use this. Valley isn't necessary. And then as for Mythical Bestiary, kind of the same thing. I don't use it in my deck list is because the mill 2 actually can't hurt. Cause it can mill parts of the Spellbook engine. It can mill your souls. It can mill your Garuda, your Kendo. Like there is enough one-ofs that Bestiary starts to become a little dangerous to use. When I used it I did use it for a bit, but I stopped because I ended up milling stuff like Garuda or like souls, right? So I probably wouldn't run this for my deck list, but like if you were to run like a Desires build, yeah, it's still good. You still run it. It's a 2-card combo, with any other card. So like Servant plus this is a full combo. And now off to this guy. So this guy was hyped a little bit, right? He looks cool, and his effect looks good on paper. I'm going to tell you why it's bad. Now, I am going to have a video of me using it. I didn't really get to use it though, because my opponent quit. But you will kind of see how it works. At least a little bit. So its monster effect has it where, so it can either be ritual summoned or pendulum summoned from the hand. So what that means is that you don't have to ritual summon it, which is good. Now, its other effect is each time your opponent special summons a monster from the extra deck, inflict 300 damage to them. That is terrible. And its other effect, its last effect, the one that you really want to use, is once per turn, when your opponent activates a spell card or effect, quick effect, you can place this card in your pendulum zone, and if you do negate that effect, then if you place this ritual summoned card in the pendulum zone, you can special summon one odd-eyes monster from your extra deck. Anywho, so the combo, as you can probably tell, is you negate a spell, and then it goes into your pendulum zone, and you tag out for a vortex. And then its pendulum effect says during the end phase, you can add one ritual spell from your deck or graveyard to your hand, then return this card to the hand. Now, let me tell you why this is terrible. So, let's start with this monster effect. For one, each time your opponent special summons effect is terrible. in general. 300 is dumb. If they wanted that to be good, they should have at least have it to be like 500 or something, or 600, or even like 800. Like, you even have cards like Masquerade that does it for like, 600 or 800? I think it is. 800, I think it is. So this could at least be like 500 at least. But moving on. Once per turn, when your opponent activates a spell card or effect, for one, it's only spell cards, so that's already limiting. And as of right now, you can probably just summon Endymion instead of this, right? Because Endymion at least does spell traps. Let's say, Endymion does at least spells and traps, and it also has protection, but this one doesn't. But, it gets even worse. So it says you can place this card in your pendulum zone. That means that if you do not have an open pendulum zone, you cannot activate his negate effect, right? And then, even if you do have an open zone and you place him in there, for you to tag out for Vortex, you must have Ritual summoned him to tag out. Now you might be thinking, okay, so what's the Ritual spell? So the Ritual spell is Allies Advent. Basically, what it does is that you can Ritual summon any dragon ritual monster by attributing any dragon ritual monster from your hand or graveyard. You must also attribute pendulum monsters from your hand or field whose total levels equal to or exceed the level of the ritual monster you ritual summon. And then if your opponent controls 2 or more and you control none, same monsters, you can send an allies from your extra deck to the graveyard, instead. But who really cares about that part? So you might be thinking, oh, that's kind of cool, right? You can ritual summon from your hand or graveyard, right? But then you realize that this guy can only be ritual summoned from your hand. Unless I'm misreading this, right? Actually, I might be misreading this. You might be able to summon him from the graveyard, maybe. It's just saying that you can only plunge him from your hand. But that's not really the issue, though. The issue is more so the fact that Allies doesn't have any targets. The ritual spell, it has no searches. Well, it has some. It does have a Performapal search. Or sorry, it does have a searcher that's a Performapal. But you're probably not running them in Endymion's. Sky Iris searches it, right? But the issue is that it has to pop a face-up card, right? Normally, if it just said, target one card, destroy it, then it would work. But since it says you must target one other face-up specifically, that's actually what makes it kind of odd. And on top of that, Sky Iris is not searchable either. So that's also another issue. And then let's say that you got a God hand, right? You got everything perfectly, right? You got a perfect hand, you did a perfect combo, you got the Advent, you just hard drew it, you summoned this guy, and then you pass. So, for one, he negates only spell cards, right? That's something to think about, right? But on top of that, you can't use Village, and you can't use Valley with him. Because if you use Village, right, his negation is worthless. Completely worthless. Because then he can't negate anything. Because you stop your opponent from using spells. So with Village, he becomes pretty much useless. For you. And then with Valley, right, so you might be thinking like, oh, this is pretty good. So if you happen to ritual summon this guy, right, and then you use it type up for Vortex, during the end phase, you cannot add that ritual spell back to your hand. And due to that, he is also stuck in the pendulum zone, because you must add the ritual spell from your graveyard to your hand for him to return to the hand. So, Valley kind of stops that from working, pretty much. But luckily he still tag out. So the issue with him is that you can't run him with Village, right? Just so we're clear. You can't run him with Village. His search for the ritual spell is during the end phase. That's an issue, right? It would be different if his pendulum effect was the ritual spell, right? Where his pendulum effect ritual summoned him, then it would be good, right? But the fact that it's during the end phase makes it really, really slow. And it means that you're probably going to ritual summon this on your turn 3, which is kind of really slow. Really slow for something that don't really give much. And the fact that it negates only spells and traps, the fact that it negates only spells has no protection means that Endymion is probably better. And the fact that even if you got everything working correctly, that like it must also be ritual summoned to even tag out. It's kind of weird. It's just really weird, or it's stuck. You know what I mean? Just So it looks good. It looks good on paper, but in practice, it's terrible. And and that's it. Okay. So just so you know, for a quick summary, if you get beyond, drop this. Don't use this. It's terrible. Well, not terrible. It's terrible for us. Don't use this. Don't give your opponent free stuff. Don't play this in any deck. Citadel is still good. Sky Iris, not so good for the pendulum graph. Allies Advent, hard to search for no reason. And Bestiaries, also good. Alright, have a nice day, guys.